For many men, pornography became their very first sexual experience, before intimacy, before connection, before real human touch. And today, pornography is instant, free, endlessly available, and accessible at younger and younger ages than ever before. So you know what that means. Millions of young men began training their brains on artificial sexual stimulation years before they ever entered a real relationship. So think about that for a minute. Think about what that means. It means that your brain may have learned pornography before it ever learned intimacy. It learned that novelty is where it's at before it learned about connection. It learned intensity over presence and stimulation over touch. So here's the question that I want you to think about today. What if pornography didn't simply affect your sex life? What if it helped train your brain for the sex life you're experiencing right now before you even knew your brain was learning? This video is brought to you by my HarperCollins published book, Mind Over Explicit Matter. If you're ready to quit porn and reclaim your life mentally and physically, go over to drtrishleigh.com/book. So the brain is incredibly efficient. It learns through repetition, prediction, and reward. And adolescence, an especially powerful period of learning because the brain is rapidly building associations between cue, anticipation, behavior, and then the subsequent reward. Now think about the sequence pornography creates. You search, you scroll, you find novelty, you become aroused, you orgasm. Then you repeat the entire sequence again. Every time that sequence occurs, the brain becomes better and better at predicting what comes next. The cue creates anticipation. Anticipation drives dopamine. Dopamine increases pursuit, and pursuit strengthens the pathway. This is where pornography can become more than something you just watch. It becomes a neurological training environment. Think about that. Your brain begins learning what to notice, what to seek, and what sexual reward is supposed to feel like. And when that training begins years before real intimacy, the reward system may already be developing expectations about sex. That, my friend, is the beginning of the hijack. So I want to ask you a question, and I really want you to think about this. If you've been consuming pornography since your early teens, or maybe even younger for many people, and your brain has spent years learning arousal through a screen, how would you know what you're actually capable of experiencing with a real partner? What if you've been measuring your sexual health against a brain that's been conditioned since you were 13? Maybe what you think is your normal sex drive isn't your neurological baseline at all. Maybe you've never experienced your full capacity for desire, connection, or intimacy because your reward system began learning artificial stimulation before you ever had the opportunity to experience the real thing. What if the sex life you've been living isn't the best your brain is capable of? What if you've simply never met that version of yourself yet? Not long ago, I was on a Zoom meeting with a man who believed he was simply going to have to live with erectile dysfunction for the rest of his life. He had done everything that he knew to do. He got the blood work done, the hormone testing, taken the supplements, done the performance medications. He had reached the point where he thought, maybe this is just who I am now. But as we talked, I asked him a question he wasn't expecting. I said, "How old were you when you first started watching pornography?" He paused. He looked away from the camera on Zoom, and then he quietly said, "Probably around 13. In that moment, the entire conversation changed because he had spent years thinking about his erection. I was thinking about his learning history. He thought we were talking about a body that stopped working. But no, I was wondering what his brain had spent decades practicing. And I told him something that gave him hope, pragmatic hope, of course. If the brain can learn a pattern, the same brain can learn a new, healthier pattern. But first you have to understand what the brain actually learned. Pornography hadn't simply changed this man's behavior. Years of repetition may have changed what his brain expected desire to feel like. This is what I call the desire miswire. 3 systems can begin changing together. Attention becomes trained toward novelty, making sustained focus more difficult than ever. The nervous system can remain increasingly activated, anticipating the next cue or reward, and arousal may gradually become more strongly associated with artificial stimulation, novelty, and anticipation. Pornography heavily engages dopamine-driven seeking and wanting, while real intimacy is neurologically much more complex. Healthy sexual connection involves reward, of course, but it also involves systems associated with bonding, attachment, trust, safety, touch, and emotional closeness. One experience can repeatedly train the brain to keep searching. The other experience asks the brain to stay present long enough to connect. And when the reward system has spent years practicing stimulation and pursuit, connection may have a harder time competing. That is the desire miswire. A growing body of neurological and behavioral research is identifying concerning patterns associated with heavy and problematic pornography use. Researchers have identified altered reward processing, increased cue reactivity, novelty-seeking, compulsive patterns, and sexual function difficulties in some users. That's a mouthful. What that means is when a person uses pornography consistently, frequently, with high intensity, it makes it so that that person's brain wants to seek for novelty more and needs higher stimulation to become aroused, ultimately leading to erectile dysfunction and what I call SAD, sexual arousal dysfunction. And this makes sense when you understand one fundamental principle of neuroscience. The brain adapts to repeated experiences. Whatever you repeatedly expose the brain to, the brain gets better at processing, predicting, and pursuing. The concern is not that every person who has ever watched pornography ever will develop a sexual problem. The concern is that repeated, high-intensity artificial sexual stimulation may condition the reward system in ways that change how some brains respond to real-life sexual experiences. Eventually, what is natural may begin to feel less stimulating than what your brain has practiced. When I map brains that have spent years in chronic overstimulation, I often see broader patterns of dysregulation or miswiring. Some brains are running fast, hyperactivated, restless, constantly scanning and constantly anticipating what comes next. I call this strained brain. Other brains appear to have gone in the opposite direction many times after chronic pornography use. Motivation drops, focus becomes harder, emotional energy disappears. The person feels flat, disconnected, and exhausted. I call this pattern drained brain. And sometimes I see features of both of those patterns. The person is exhausted, but they still can't shut their brain off. They feel numb, but they continue searching for stimulation. They don't even necessarily want more. Their brain has become simply very good at seeking for more. This is what chronic overstimulation can do to the nervous system. The brain keeps adapting until the pattern begins feeling normal. So if you remember one thing from this brief, remember this. When you first started watching pornography, you probably had no idea your brain was learning from it. You weren't trying to change your future sex life. You weren't deliberately teaching your reward system to expect endless novelty, high levels of intensity, and overstimulation. Your brain was simply doing what brains do. It was learning from repetition. So remember this, your brain became very good at the pattern it repeatedly practiced. And here's the hopeful part. Neuroplasticity doesn't only work in one direction. The same fundamental capacity that allowed your brain to learn one pattern is the same capacity that allows it to build another. So what actually happens when the training environment changes? Recovery isn't simply about white-knuckling your way through an urge or counting the number of days since you last watched pornography. It really is about giving your reward system an opportunity to recalibrate. When repeated artificial sexual stimulation is interrupted, the brain is no longer experiencing the same cue, pursuit, novelty, and reward cycle over and over again. Over time, healthier reward pathways have the opportunity to strengthen through exercise, achievement, conversation, purpose, and of course, real intimacy. Experiences that once felt flat to you may gradually become rewarding again. This is why some men report changes that extend far beyond their sex lives when their brains rewire. They describe better focus, more motivation, greater emotional presence, and stronger connection. The goal isn't simply to become less interested in pornography. The goal is to help your brain become more responsive to real life. That is the beginning of the true rewire. Many people can in fact begin this process on their own. That's why I'm here with these videos. They change their behavior, remove pornography, rebuild healthy routines, and their brain begins adapting. But not every brain returns to healthy function at the same speed or in the same way. Sometimes the patterns of miswiring, the dysregulation, the dysfunction have been reinforced for years. Sometimes there's broader attention, anxiety, sleep, or reward system patterns involved. This is where understanding your individual brain patterns becomes incredibly important. Brain mapping allows us to identify the patterns of brainwave dysregulation, the functional dysfunction in the brain, rather than simply guessing based on symptoms. And targeted neuromodulation technology can help train your brain toward healthier patterns of function. This isn't about replacing behavior change. Behavior matters. But sometimes a person has been trying harder for years and years when what they really need is a better understanding of their own brain, the brain that fundamentally they're trying to change. Okay, so what you're looking at here is more than just a graph. This is the graph that I use with clients. It is evidence that the brain can change. On the left, you're seeing patterns associated with a brain that is in a pattern of dysfunction. It is miswired. As we train the brain, those patterns begin shifting. Excessive activation can begin settling. The nervous system can become more regulated. It's rewiring. Attention can become more stable, and the brain may become less driven by the constant search for the next intense reward that it's been looking for. This is where the goal changes. We are no longer simply asking, how do I stop watching pornography? Instead, we begin asking a much bigger question. What do I want my brain to become good at, very good at? Presence, focus, connection, healthy attachment in the real world, real intimacy. This is what becoming hardwired for life looks like. The brain is no longer organized around constant stimulation. It is becoming better trained for the life that you actually want to live, the one that you deserve. So stop here for a second and pause and take a screenshot. This is because this is your brain hack for the week. For the next 7 days, change the training environment. No pornography, no private browsing, no artificial sexual stimulation. But don't simply remove something and sit there thinking about what you're not doing. That's not going to help. Intentionally give your brain real life experiences to respond to. If you're in a relationship, spend uninterrupted time with your partner. Make it intimate and connection. Practice sustained eye contact, physical touch without turning every interaction into a test of sexual performance. Go on a date. Have a conversation without your phone in your hand. If you're single, get back into your real life. exercise, socialize, create, accomplish something difficult. The goal is to remind your reward system that real life contains rewards, great rewards. And if you're doing this with me for the next 7 days, please go down into the comments and comment one word below. Rewire. Let's do this, baby. So you remember the man I told you about at the beginning? The man who joined my Zoom call convinced he was simply going to have to live with erectile dysfunction for the rest of his life? Well, a few months into his work with me, into my program, he told me that intimacy was feeling natural and coming online again. He wasn't constantly monitoring his erection. He wasn't mentally checking whether he was aroused enough. He wasn't chasing a specific feeling or comparing the experience to something else anymore. He was simply there, present with his partner, connected and enjoying it. And this is the part of my work that I wish that more men understood. Improving sexual function is, of course, very important, but this is bigger than performance. This is about helping your brain become available for the experience you're actually having. This man, he did not get a new body. He changed the pattern his brain has spent years practicing. He was becoming hardwired for connection. Okay, so if you're listening to me right now and you're realizing that pornography may have trained your brain long before you understood what was happening, I want you to know that your brain can change. Hear me on that. But stopping pornography may only be the beginning, not the end. The next step is understanding your brain and deliberately training it toward the life you actually want, the intimacy that you want, the desire that you want. That's exactly why I created Desire Rewire. In my program, we help people understand where your brain may have become hijacked. We identify the patterns that have become miswired and create a path toward efficient rewiring. In that way, your brain can become healthier and improve focus, motivation, connection, and of course, intimacy. If you're ready to understand your brain and find out what your next step could be, please go over to drtrishleigh.com. Reach out through the contact form, and a skilled professional from my team will help you understand the right path for you. Your brain became very good at one pattern. Right now is the time, my friend, to deliberately teach it another. You got this. All right, remember, please remember, control your brain, or in fact, it will control you, and I'll see you next time.